Okay, thank you so much. I've been asked to also pick up the pace because we have a great deal more to cover, and I want to make sure that we get through all of it. You'll forgive me for picking up the pace here. If I'm too brisk, you can stop me and ask me to slow down, but talking fast is not usually. I've had 99 problems. That's not one. So we'll walk through it here as we go. Conservation. We talked about a lot of things, but conservation, I think, is principally important to our discussion. Washington County is currently demanding about 270 gallons per capita per day. This does not include secondary use. Governor's conservation goal would reduce the value to 251 gallons per capita per day by 2025. Conservation would increase capacity of the existing water system, but does not come without a cost. I think there is this general belief that conservation is somehow free, and that's just not the case. This is a report, January 2011. It was done for the state of Colorado. It was referenced in some other reports that you all have seen. It brings up this concept of active water conservation and passive water conservation. Passive water conservation is, my toilet broke, I had to buy a new one, I bought one that uses less water, that kind of thing. Active water conservation are things like education programs, landscape audits, watering restrictions, turf replacement programs, retrofit programs, things like that. In this report, they essentially made the assumption that passive water conservation is zero and active water conservation is about $10,600 per acre foot to essentially achieve. Now, I'm not here to suggest which one of those is exactly right, but rather to say, hey, look, active can be relatively expensive, particularly when you try to conserve a great deal as a result of that. When they added the passive and the conservative together, they got a low scenario of about 6,000, a high scenario of about 8,200 in terms of total. You've also seen a report from Western Resource Associates. I believe this has been provided to you. I'm certainly not going to talk about the veracity of this particular document, but they did suggest that the cost per acre foot is about $13,980 for the community, the latter of which includes cost of both customers, and the utility. So what I would like you to think about for a moment and help me with is what level of conservation do you think is reasonable for Washington County? I would remind you again, and again this isn't meant to sway you one way or the other, I'm sure there's lots of opinions. The governor's office is of course the 25% by 2051. Some people think they can achieve that, some people think they cannot. So if you'd answer that question for me, I would appreciate it. Okay, looks like we got pretty close. In the respect for time, I'm going to hit the little button here. Okay, so generally speaking, overall, we tend to think that getting to where the governor wanted to ultimately achieve is going to be very difficult overall. That's what this chart tells me. Essentially, just so that we're looking at this correctly, essentially what this says is the number 3, about a little more than a third were there. 6 and 5 is somewhere between this range and this range, skewing a little bit back toward the 3, right? 4, 5, and 6 there, but it's kind of skewing back toward the 3. So respecting that, we'll choose something for purposes of our discussion that's kind of closer to that 285, but a little bit higher than that, or excuse me, a little lower than that in terms of what you'll ultimately consume. Maybe 275 or something along those lines. I need to ask you the same question in terms of what you think Washington County can achieve by 2050. Now this is looking out far in the future, but I'd like to know what you think we can achieve by 2050. If you would mind answering the same question. We got 16 here. Okay, so by 2050, we think we can really get to the governor's goal. Maybe we think we can get a little bit higher than the governor's goal overall by the time we get there. Okay? So what I'd like to do first is I'm going to put those numbers in to our model. Years of supply, we said 7.5. Well, actually, we were closer to about 10. This is where we took our break. Back. Water supply. Okay, so now make sure we're looking at this right. This is our supply of water. This is our sort of risk factor here. This is our demand for water, and this is our buffer here. This just says, hey, we need to be looking 10 years out into the future. You know what? 10 was probably a little bit high because there was some balancing in there. I'm just going to come back and I'm going to make that 7.5 just to make sure that I'm being respectful of everyone's comments that we've received. Let's just call it 7 years. We can move it up in a moment as we go forward, but we'll just put there. So you'll notice that my line just moved down. They're a little closer together. So then we have our conservation. We generally thought, let me jump back for just a moment. Okay, so we generally thought we were going to be in the 275 range, 275 range here. We thought we were going to be somewhere close to 5. Let's just jump to the second one. Thought we were going to be somewhere close to 5. That looks fairly well balanced, so I'm just going to use 251 here. Okay, so essentially we're going to reduce 18% from where we were in 2000, 25% by 2050, 2060, and then we need to think about the cost of conservation. This is the Western Resource Associates number. We can include it, we can exclude it for purposes of our discussion here. Let's just call it 10,000 to start for a moment, respecting the fact that that's going to be probably somewhat conservative overall. We can certainly use the higher number if you feel comfortable with that. And then I've got this question down here, do we want to model in the cost of conservation? It doesn't come for free. Someone's got to pay for it overall. I'm going to keep this at no, just for the moment here, respecting the amount of time that we have. So this is where the governor, this is where we are today. This is where we would be with the conservation assumption we just talked about. Essentially, these are our lines, essentially moving away from each other. We're conserving a little bit more as we go forward, right? We see now the conservation is the green line. Forgive me for going quickly, but hopefully we'll get it. We've shifted down, right? This is now our conservation-based demand for water. This is our buffer. This is how much water we have. You see the evaporation line that we've got there. So now we have a lot of the component parts built in to our model. Right? This is the cost of our conservation over time as we build it up and move forward. This is the cost of the Lake Powell Pipeline project. I'm going to make the assumption that we're all on the same page. I've actually used the number that was used in the Economist letter. And then we've got the interest rate. If no one minds, I'm going to use an interest rate of 4%. This was kind of in the middle of what the Economist talked about. What I'd like to do is jump forward for a minute and talk about the Economist models. We were talking during the break. We were talking about, these are very complicated issues, and simplicity can sort of be difficult when we talk through some of these issues. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. When we talk about the Economist models, I want to show you what the Economists did as part of their model here. Let me see how I can make this a little easier to look at. So I'll just make this a little bit bigger, and I've got to go through this very quickly, but I want to let everyone know exactly what these economists did, because again, there were limitations to what they would provide. And on the surface, those percentage growth rates, they seem extremely scary, right? So the economist said the pipeline is going to cost $969 million. We're at 4% interest. If we just carry that out over 50 years, right, it would cost us $45.1 million every year. I ran these numbers past them. They match their analysis. We may have made some tweaks over time. Unfortunately, there's some issues here. Right? Number one is you don't need the water. Right? You still have a surplus in terms of water during most of the years, at least we're looking at here. Over there is where we start running out of water. You don't need it here, so the idea that you pay for it, to say nothing of the fact that if we look at this cost, and all of a sudden we see these huge increases in water rates, right? We see these increases in the amount per 1,000 gallons consumed, the annual cost per capita, impact fees going to $20,000. Well, of course they do, because we're comparing something we're going to need down there with the people that are living here and the development that's happening in 2014. Something of an apples to oranges comparison, to be sure. Again, not intended to suggest that's what the actual impact fees would ever be. They didn't even want to suggest that, but rather to say the differentials here may ultimately be important. In addition to that, the other limitation to this analysis is the fact that it was an either-or deal, right? When you're seeing $2.88 increase in the water rate, when you're seeing that, that essentially assumes that 100% of this $45 million annual payment is loaded on water rates, where the annual cost of that or is loaded 100% on impact fees. In reality, these are mutually exclusive. right? If you do one, you don't need to do the other. So the idea that we would suggest that water rates would go up by hundreds of percent at the same time impact fees would go up by 100%, beside the fact that this doesn't look anything like the Lake Powell pipeline. Do you see only 70% taken down? Do you see that water will be taken down in blocks? Do you see any of the things that we've already gone through? You probably can't see anything because this font is so small on my spreadsheet. But assure you that as we walk through it, we're getting to the same place. This is what the economists would have in terms of their model. Again, not to say that this is how it's going to be done, but rather to offer some perspective and encourage additional ideas. This would say at 7, 5, 4, and 3% interest, where they did their analysis, what that straight line cost would be. Again, no 70%, no taking it down by blocks, certainly not reflective of the Lake Powell Pipeline Act. This is the cumulative expenditures over time. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this as well. In the second analysis that the economists did, they offer a secondary analysis where they assume a prepayment that essentially Washington County is going to prepay about $96.9 million, about 10% of the project. You're going to pay at the point at which it's constructed. Probably a very prudent thing given what's required. What year do they want to make that payment? 2014. In this analysis, they assume a rate of interest of 3%, which was made in testimony that was given before the legislature, so they were deferring to that there. The fact that it's different, somewhat irrelevant for purposes of our conversation here. So let's look at this now. Here's this analysis, right? Respecting the fact that it is limited in terms of its sophistication, absolutely purposely so. I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. You'll certainly, I would ask your indulgence as you bear with me. The same assumptions are made here in this particular analysis, the secondary one that's provided in the October 2012 letter. Let's take a look at it. You've got the population growth, you've got the $969 million initial investment that happens in a single year, you've got the capital investment taking your numbers down. You then have multiple capital events. The assumption here was that Washington County would essentially pay $126 million in 2015, then would pay $373 million in 2017, and then would pay another $370 million in 2019 for purposes of our discussion. Again, we balanced it off. They make the assumption that you capitalize the interest. For those that aren't familiar with the idea of capitalized interest, when this gets constructed, they're making the assumption that Washington County is feeling the entirety of that debt, right? That you are having to absorb it. That as that interest accrues, that you are going to have to pay it at some point in time. Completely the opposite of at least what we understood from the Lake Powell Pipeline Act and the letters that I showed you before. They make the assumption that was offered, and I think reasonable, of a $20 million payment that will ultimately be followed by a straight line amortization of whatever the balance is. And I can tell you at the back end, it's somewhere between $1 and $1.1 billion.